Hi, welcome back. In this video I wanted to compare the Fujifilm GFX100SII, which I've recently had on loan from Fujifilm, to the Fujifilm XT5. That's an unfair comparison, I hear you say. Well, yes it is on some levels, but what about the bigger picture? Yeah, okay, I know GFX produces much bigger pictures, but that's not really what I meant. As always, this will be a review from my own personal perspective as a stills photographer, taking in a few technical aspects, but mainly being more of an informal review based on my interactions with both of these cameras. I thought I'd break it down into several categories, which are going to be size, weight and handling, responsiveness, emotional connection, and finally image quality. So starting with size, weight and handling, spoiler alert, the GFX is bigger and heavier and the XT5 is smaller and lighter. It's most noticeable with the lenses though, where the GFX lenses seem to dwarf the APS-C X-mount lenses. I guess there are a few exceptions in both camps to this, but generally this is how it has to be. The XT5 seems to fit very nicely in my smallish hands, and lots of people have said that their little finger has nowhere to go, or not nowhere to go, nowhere to rest. But mine seems okay. The GFX has a nice texture grip which feels substantial, and you're definitely aware you're holding a piece of serious equipment when you hold it. Although the GFX wasn't quite as heavy as I'd expected, I did find it more tiring holding it with one hand when you're adjusting other things or having to move it around. Obviously this will be very different for those with larger, stronger and probably younger hands. It highlights one of the key questions raised in this comparison, which is concerning use cases of these different cameras. The XT5 can be a travel companion, an everyday camera, but is also capable of awesome image quality. But more on that later. The GFX100S, however, is an out-and-out image quality beast and lends itself to epic shoots and critical usage where the final image needs to be the ultimate in image quality and croppability. I'm not sure whether it would be most people's idea of an everyday travel camera though. When you have a crew or you're in a studio or a professional work situation, the presence of the GFX will set minds at rest and show that this person really means business. Having used the XT5 at several weddings and small informal events, I'm sure that its small size and retro looks allow it to get amongst the scene without disturbing it. It's got a sort of friendly face. This allows you to move discreetly and capture more of the natural goings on in a situation. With regard to responsiveness, I spoke about the shutter sound in my review that I did on another video, and it sounds like you've set the shutter speed to about half a second even when you haven't, and I found this really quite off-putting. There's no such feeling with the XT5, which I've always found very responsive. Obviously with 100 megapixels in the GFX, there's so much data to process, and it's got the same processor as the XT5, so you would imagine it was a bit slower. The autofocus on the XT5 seems faster than the GFX, which is sort of what I expected. When trying to photograph my grandson running around, I found it difficult to get shots in focus with the GFX, but the camera I had didn't have the latest firmware update, so maybe it's better now. It might be that the lenses that I chose weren't the best at focusing either. I find the XT5 just not too bad in normal use, and it's got the latest firmware, which is 4.10, which was released in December 2024. The menus and settings are very similar on both cameras, and it was quite nice to sort of chop and change between the two. On the emotional connection with the cameras, obviously this is a very personal one, but for me, the GFX just looks like another camera. Maybe that makes me shallow, I don't know. But I wasn't drawn to it like I am with the XT5. That becomes an important factor if it means that you want to grab the camera and go out and shoot just for the sheer joy of it. There are definitely those that regard a camera just as a tool to get a job done, and they don't have an emotional connection with it as such, but they have an emotional connection with the artwork that they produce. Does this make them more purists? I'm not sure, but I know I'm not one of those people. I'm inspired by the equipment, using it and the images I create. I've always loved tech. I've grown up in such a formative time for tech development, and I can't and probably won't step away from that sort of interest. Needless to say that the XT5 wins here, as I'm always excited to pick it up, use it, and see the images it produces. Okay, so here's the big one, image quality. I went out with both cameras and tried to take similar shots with each one. It wasn't massively scientific, so there are differences, but hopefully this should give us a good idea of how the two cameras compare. One thing I haven't touched on is the medium format look. It's probably down to my usage or the lens I used, but it hasn't really hit me as something that I've seen. There is definitely a shallower depth of field for a given aperture, but maybe the whole thing comes into its own more for portraits. I mean, that's not really part of what I do, and maybe it's just user shortcomings on my part. So here are two images. The one on the left is the XT5 and the one on the right is the GFX100SII. And at first glance, they look very similar to me. If I were to zoom in 100%, then we get the sense that the GFX obviously has much more resolution and detail going back into the picture. And obviously it's a bigger picture generally. But if one puts it to a similar sort of size, then they're not, I didn't find them massively different. And this is something that I've been wrestling with, I guess. So if I go back to another image, so there's another couple of images here. Let's zoom out of those two. Again, they look very similar. I've swapped them around just to keep you guessing. Well, it's not because you can see it there. But XT5 on the right, GFX on the left. I've tried to sort of edit them, as I say, sort of as I would, but trying to keep them similar as well. And yeah, so if I go and just look at this one, so this is the XT5 image, and then switch to the GFX image. It looks slightly more saturated, but then maybe that's because that's the edit. It's so difficult with these things because they don't come out the same. So if I whack a bit more saturation on that one, then they look a bit more similar. And this is the sort of thing I'm saying. So is there a sort of innate quality difference here over this one? Or to most people, would they look exactly the same? And it might be in this case, looking at something, a landscape in front of us, that I'm not showing the GFX at its best. I'm not sure. But anyway, this is the use case that I have. So, and on the last one of these few examples, one of my rotational images, this is created on the XT5, and it seemed to come out better on this one than the one on the GFX. The lines are less defined. I don't know whether there's so many megapixels on the GFX that it is difficult to move the camera around and maintain that defined movement, or the resolution is such that it smudges the issue. Again, I mean, not a use case that many people look into, but you know, I'm really happy with the image from the XT5 and don't feel like the GFX is bringing loads more to the table. Another couple of images here, I'm getting them similar as best I can. Again, they both look like beautiful images to me, and as I said in the review of the GFX, I mean, the resolution is amazing, and you could print just a tiny little crop out of the GFX images on the left here, and it look amazing slightly. But I mean, even so, I mean, that's pretty amazing on the XT5, to be fair. So, oh, there's a person there. Again, just to show you the difference in images, if I go and find another one. Again here, similar scene and similar sort of vibe, I guess. I've edited these and used various masks and stuff to highlight different areas and add colour, trying to sort of edit each one individually and see what I could end up with. So we've got the GFX on the left and the XT5 on the right, and again very similar from this sort of viewpoint. just looking at one individual image. So this is the XT5 and this is the GFX. So if I were to crop the GFX image down to a 2:3, which one of the things I mentioned in the review of the GFX, I didn't find myself massively keen on the 4:3 aspect ratio. Yeah, you just get so much detail and croppability with the GFX. There is definitely more dynamic range and it's easier to clip the files from the XT5. And I think whilst editing this picture in particular, I was noticing if I push things, I start getting some banding of the blues in this area. So you have to be slightly more careful, but this in no way is it, and obviously this is a slightly different picture and the sun wasn't in this picture, but going back to the XT5, in no way is it, oh, these pictures are, you know, rubbish and you have to treat them with kid gloves. I mean, there's a lot of, if I go back to the original picture, you can see that was the before edit and this is the edit afterwards. So I've done quite a lot. Let's look at another couple of images. So I moved into some urban environment here. This is the XT5 and this is the GFX. And the differences I see are more to do with my editing than anything else from looking at the global picture sort of view. So here, that looks slightly lighter than that one. But I mean, that's down to my edit, which, as I say, it's quite tricky to keep them exactly the same. So if I push the brightness up on the right-hand one a tiny bit more, is that better? And you can see by the clouds that the conditions were changing on a second-by-second basis, so it was quite tricky. But they're both very nice images. This is the XT5. This is the GFX. Yes, you can see obviously much more detail again. And if you wanted to sort of use this as a zoom, then, you know, it's amazing with that amount of megapixel and croppability. It really does outshine the XT5. Again here, this is the GFX. No, it's not. It's the XT5 image. And this is the GFX image. So this sort of range, there's not a whole lot of difference. I mean, again, my edit could be slightly different. So another image here. Again, that's the GFX. That's the XT5. And if I put them side by side, they're very comparable. And I think this is the point I'm finding with this for my usage. If I'm looking at pictures at a sensible magnification, it's not like one is like, oh my goodness, that's amazing, and the other one's rubbish. Here in my edit, this looks slightly more punchy. This is the XT5. And on the left, my edit isn't quite as punchy. It's sort of down to the decisions I make during my edit and minor fader movements. On the left is the XT5 and on the right is the GFX. I mean, I don't need to do this because you know by now that the detail is amazing on the GFX. I mean, bearing in mind that the GFX costs £5,000 and the XT5 costs 1,600 or something, that's quite a lot of difference. And I'm not seeing that much difference that I could justify for my usage. And, you know, plenty of detail. I mean, uber detail, obviously, in the GFX, but, you know, still plenty of detail in the XT5 because they are very large files even so. I mean, it's a 40 megapixel camera, which a number of years ago would be lots. So that was looking at the images that I took. So hopefully I can try and sum up some conclusions now. To sum up, there's no doubt that the GFX yields technically better images than the XT5. The question I keep asking myself is, do I need that level of image quality in my work and my life as a photographer? My images will almost never be seen at sizes where you can really tell the difference in detail. And even when my images have been printed really large sizes for clients, that was only with a 42 megapixel Sony camera. So the 40 megapixels of the XT5 are probably just fine. It's so easy to sit at your computer and zoom in to 100, 200, 300% and criticize its quality. But this is a sort of unique circumstance that photographers do and doesn't really arise in the real world once you've delivered the image and it's used for whatever purpose it was going to be used for, such as prints or social media or internet or even photo books or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I hold my hand up and admit that I'm guilty of judging the technical image quality of a picture by how it looks when I zoom in. I really want to stop doing this, as I feel it holds me back and sort of detracts from my enjoyment of the photographs. Obviously, when I'm out shooting, I'm in the moment and I'm concentrating on composition, light and feel and emotion of the shot. I want to keep in that zone and not find myself going into pixel peeping land all the time. I was looking at some old photographs that my mum found recently, and they were filled with memories and atmosphere, but you couldn't make out the details in it, however much I pinched into zoom on the bit of paper. They're still great shots and serve their function as historical records, though. It feels a bit like I'm doing some sort of counselling session here. But the more I get into the reviews and comparing stuff through doing these videos, it seems to throw up questions about my constant pursuit of new kit. Maybe we've reached a point at which cameras are good enough, and until someone comes up with a genuinely groundbreaking innovation, it's just difficult to decide whether one actually gets any increased value with all of the new things that come out. It's the same when I have my music composer hat on with music tech in my studio. The updates of things and software seem to bring less and less major quality enhancements, and they're more about workflow and, bizarrely, trying to emulate shortcomings of old analog gear, adding distortion and colouring and all that sort of thing. And with so many interested in film and editing in a filmic way and putting filters on and mist filters and all that sort of thing, that's the way that photography is going as well. So yeah, that's strange. In many cases, people are getting better, higher resolution cameras with sharper lenses, only to add these mist filters and film type edits with their image. And it sounds very like a strange contradiction to me. Maybe the argument is that the more quality, resolution and dynamic range we have, we're free to make those decisions and we're not having to just be forced into those choices. Getting back to these two cameras, I really admire the GFX. I know its images are amazing, but I don't want one at the moment because I haven't experienced enough added value to me personally, and it's a bit too bulky for me to grab for my everyday carry. Who knows what the future brings though. I love the XT5 though. It's small and inspires me to shoot and amazes me with the images that come out of such a small sensor and body combination. I feel like I want to prove that it's enough. So that wraps up my comparison of these two cameras. I hope you found it interesting and managed to get something out of it. And if you did, if you could subscribe or hit the like button, I'd be very grateful as it helps the channel. And I look forward to seeing you back here soon.